We're going to continue to talk a bit about the complex system stuff, but in a broader, sort of more Q&A session. So let's kick it off with external questions, if anybody has one left over from the talks. Crickets. Cool. Okay.
I guess, yeah. So maybe just a more general question. So how do you guys educate people that are looking into these systems, right? How do you communicate the need for your type of research? And then how do you validate, then after you've convinced them this is important, how do you validate the value of that engagement? So I know it's super high level, not specific to the system.
I can start, but I think we can have multiple answers. So, I mean, my answer is that from an education standpoint, it tends to be we're building out educational materials in parallel with research materials. It's actually a different labor because it's a different audience, and it's part of the reason that we need more collaborations. People speak to different groups in different ways. There's an organization called Systems Innovation that's been doing business applied complex systems education for some time, and that's one of the groups, people that I've looked to for what I would call executive and or just general sort of non-technical, I'm excited about thinking in terms of complex systems education and in terms of validating. The reality is that validation depends on the stage you're validating from. The vast majority of things that are like design oriented don't have a sort of immediate falsifiability associated with them. You can look at the long-term trends and you can look at the sort of decisions that you are forced to make later and try to infer about how well you've done and how you can change. The lower you go down the technical stack, the more sort of formal and falsifiable things are, with the boundary zone being the things where like data science type methods apply. That's right where the subjectivity meets the objectivity. You can show almost anything that you want if you know how to do it, but if you're scientific, then you're making well-scoped assumptions, asking questions and answering them, but there's a subjectivity in the scoping. So all the way from unfalsifiable to boundary to directly verifiable depends on context.
Do you want to answer? I guess you want.
I mean, it's as for the research part, we're really at the beginning. It's we're also starting to create standards for, we're learning with every project. So we only just started now as the Institute. I mean, Michael has been doing that for a bit longer. But we're at the beginning, and each project is also different. So evaluating the effectiveness of a project or a collaboration is a function of what our role was. I think I was talking about that before. Yeah.
So directly answering the question, so how we communicate is that we participate in events such as today. So this is what we want to do. We want to reach out to practitioners or to people who are interested in the scene, but also we want to reach out to researchers and academic institutions as well. So our main goal is to bring everyone on the same table to talk. Right, and if you followed my talk, so my main conclusion is that we really managed to bring the people who are building the systems with the people who are capable of understanding the systems, but we need to formalize the same language, and we need to provide them both something tangible that they can discuss, right? Because this was one of the major issues that we had until then. Yeah.
I think the process of finding a common ground is quite long, right? Maybe to be very specific, because you asked me about the project, right? And then the Vienna, our collaboration with the city of Vienna. We all had the same idea, the same impulse of, okay, Vienna wants to create a token to incentivize a public collaboration towards a certain goal. And then we decided that the CO2 emission reduction would be a pragmatic thing to do because we had a company that had developed an app for tracking CO2 emission reduction for 10 years. So we could have smart collaboration, right? So that was quite pragmatic. And everybody was very hyped, like the company creating that app in the city of Vienna and all the stakeholders within the city of Vienna. It's a multi-stakeholder system there. And we were very hyped, and another university. But then we realized that we had completely underestimated the scoping phase of that project. And I think this is also what we saw in the mutual project we did together with Block Science for that blockchain startup. That one tends to underestimate the initial scoping phase that is so necessary. Why? For two reasons. Because you're in a multi-stakeholder system, and even within a company, not everybody has the same knowledge base. And you need to have, this is a process of at least 3 months, usually longer, to get to the state where you have the same knowledge base, because there are information asymmetries, expectation asymmetries of what one can do in which time, right? And this is something. So there was a lot of misaligned expectations, misinformation in the project we did in the city of Vienna, which led to a lot of frustrations. But luckily, we could turn this around. Everybody was reasonable, and we realized altogether that we had underestimated it, and that this required a longer scoping phase than we had initially thought. And so for the next projects, we will account for a scoping phase of at least 3 months, right? I mean, it depends on the complexity of the project.
So, sort of to that point, though, I think one of the challenges that we run into is that if you're working in a startups domain, there's not generally much of a tolerance for a longer design and scoping phase. The natural tempo of a startup is going to be to sort of build it, sort of let it break, fix it. It's a very iterative methodology, and there's actually nothing wrong with this. It's actually been shown to work in a lot of settings. It was the sort of dominant mode of the sort of app development sort of archetype. And what we have to recognize is that methodology is actually part of an engineering process. It's part of an iterative process, and it's perfectly valid when you are in the neighborhood of your solution, or when you are, close enough that the best way to converge to, say, product market fit is literally to try, measure, and iterate, and that is the right thing to do. The problem arises when the space that you're trying to design in is too big and too messy and complex, where it doesn't reduce to product market fit when you have N stakeholders with lots of different sort of not immediately modelable utilities. You have to spend a lot more time constructing 2, 3, 4 perspectives on the problem and coming up with a design that actually makes sense from each of the perspectives. And then you can start a process that's much more familiar in this iterative design development. Again, we're not throwing away that process by any means, but you have a sort of a macro iteration that represents getting the problem posed right, which then allows you into the more micro iterations. And this is not like a waterfall method. It's just multi-scale agile. It's like big agile, little agile, and then even when you think about how agile works, it's multi-scale because you've got, these multi-month sort of targets, then you've got this sort of whatever your sprint lengths are, and then you've even got daily stand-ups. So this just takes it out one more and asks bigger questions about these multi-stakeholder ecosystems and how we want them to work, how we want them to evolve. And this often means there's an upfront cost to syncing between a team that's expertise is in helping design and test and implement these things and a team that kind of owns the problem. But I like to use an architecture example. When an architect firm is brought in, they don't usually start building the building right away. They actually don't even start designing the building right away. They start with, so what is where are we going to put this building, and why do you want it, and what is it meant to achieve? And, using, large scale systems as examples, suddenly we're like, oh yeah, the build is going to be, based on a process that's actually pretty iterative, but that's at the level of the subcontractors and the general contractors and the surveyors that are validating things as you go, all the way back to a pretty exhaustive design and computer-aided evaluation, design testing phase, all the way back to who wants this, why do they want it, and like that ultimate stakeholder. So it's a better analogy, in my opinion, to use large-scale infrastructure to manage your design process for crypto economics than it is to treat it like, you know, Web 2 product development.
So maybe we are at the stage where we are making a point that this what we do needs to be done. So we're defining our fields of work, I would say. So imagine that you want to, as Michael said, you want to build something, right? And then the construction workers and the people who are going to use the infrastructure meet, right? And then they say, okay, we want to build this, the construction workers say, and the other say, we want to use it, right? But they don't have the plan. So what we need to establish is the understanding that something like a digital decentralized system architect is a job description, or basically something that needs to be like.
Yeah. Yes. And I find kind of like your challenge that it's like, oh, we have an idea, let's just start building it, right? We're gonna iterate, fail, whatever, because everyone is very much in the agile mindset.
Exactly.
Right? And then being able to take a step back and say, no, hold on a second. There's all these things. It's gonna take like 3 months. So that's kind of like the challenge that I.
Yeah, because people are used to just software implementation projects, like just do it, right? Yeah. You need a web page, just pay someone to do it, right? You need this, pay someone to do it. So this is what the mentality needs to be.
But of course, you get what you asked for or nothing else. So if you throw someone a thing and say, "Oh, give me a this," you're gonna get what they think that means, not what you think that means. And the problem with this right now is we don't even have necessarily the tools and methods to share the communication. So the task of this event, and many of us here, is to start to converge to a set of, first, just like shared language, ultimately best practices and standards, and eventually get to the point where these things are more streamlined. No one's suggesting that it should be like, all the way from pure academic R&D to development every time, but that is kind of where we are right now. So we're trying to compress that. You always want basically as much process as you need and no more. And in this case, we're saying the as much process as you need and no more is a little bit bigger because we're trying to figure out how to do new things. And as the best practices emerge and the standards get put together, we're going to start to compress that some. So I want to try to open up to another question. Would you mind using a mic? Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Just a general question with regards to this multidisciplinary requirements that these complex systems require, because I'm in a company where we're in the middle of building decentralized clearing networks, and it does require most of our architects, including ourselves, to be both the lawyers, the economists, the entity structure, the governance structure, as well as the computer scientist, as well as the consensus engineer, etc. Academia is not building these people. The market is not building these people. The general question is, are you working? Do you see signs that such multidisciplinary people will come through? I mean, we are in MIT here, so hopefully somebody's listening.
I talked to Neha yesterday, who is the head of. She opened this, and I invited her to come today. And I told her what we're doing in Vienna and that we have this interdisciplinary approach. And she seemed very reluctant or rolled her eyes and said, kind of good luck, right? Because it's a really hard thing to do. And this coming from somebody who's working at MIT, for me means that we're not there yet. But I do think that we're trying hard to do it, and it's really, really hard work. I'm not seeing any institutions that are already churning out multidisciplinary students, but it's happening more and more. We're working on it. I think it will change over the next few years, but we're at the very early stages.
And I just want to add in a promotion for a program that came from the University of Pennsylvania. So it's called Network System and Social System Engineering. So the student there study like network science, statistics, computer science, game theory. So I guess Zargham helps design the program, and then I was one of the graduates from the program. And That's why I think we are able to appreciate a lot of this interdisciplinary topics. And then after that, you add into your own research, and then like now you can be able to, I guess, take some of the challengers or the roles that you mentioned.
If by help designed he means I was a guinea pig, so I was a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania in a research lab that spanned the robotics and the like Wharton groups. So we had interdisciplinarians working with sort of systems engineering and sort of holistic, very architecture-like, but for social and economic systems in my research group. But as a PhD student, we were taking a bunch of seminars from all of the professors, and they were basically, hey, like, can you handle this? Does this make sense? Like, it eventually coalesced into the NETS program. There's the Warren Center for Networked and Data Sciences, which is the graduate program at Penn that's in this same hybrid vein. There is a socio-technical systems research group here at MIT that my former PhD advisor is now the director of. Though the thing that I've noticed here is that crypto hasn't percolated into these groups yet. So I actually advised ZX's master's thesis because one of my former collaborators on these sort of networked infrastructure type of research papers was his master's thesis advisor. And when he wanted to do crypto, my friend was like, oh, hey, can you come help? So I think what we're going to see is these systems, social systems and economic systems engineering type of thing. It's coming out of the fact that people are starting to recognize our Web2 infrastructure is having widespread systemic effects. And they're picking up, as academia tends to do, slow as hell. And so they're like 10 years behind us being like, oh no, how are these algorithms inside of, Amazon and Facebook and whatever, like perturbing and basically screwing with our economic and social systems. And we're out in this sort of, we'll say bridge territory between research and practice, trying to figure out this sort of the robotics or the systems engineering type of role or the architect type role for these social and economic systems. And we should be looking to programs like the NETS program and others that are emerging in other institutions to feed us the people that you're looking for.
What I'm seeing is that so more and more blockchain startups, for example, are realizing that they actually need to hire economists. But the problem is that most people are not studying economics. They're studying, at least in Vienna, we're a school of business and economics, and most people study business. And what I'm trying to say is like, as we're entering what we're teaching today at business schools is already inadequate for the Web 2, and it will be even more inadequate for the Web 3. For example, at our university, luckily, I completely forgot that we're creating a digital economy master right now, which will draw a lot on network science knowledge. But academia is usually very slow. This is something that should have been done actually 10, 15 years ago when the Web 2 became a thing. And now the universities are adapting their curricula to the Web 2, and we're already in the Web 3. So there is this huge time lag in governance of curricula. Yeah.
So this is going back to research. There was always this problem of education and research in academia, but can you please define what success would look like in the research agenda in, let's say, 3 years, from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for that question. I probably need to think more about it, right? But it would be successful if we have a really interdisciplinary research group of network scientists, let's say, and lawyers and cryptographers working together and having a common language. That would be a success, because this common language and this common space from which you can work out of, this is where you can really do interdisciplinary research. I'm already seeing this happen. I think, but that would be one thing. Another successful thing would be if we could impact future curricula to be more interdisciplinary. Find that a lot of what we're doing right now is missionary work. we're trying to say like the tools that universities are providing are in many cases inadequate, and the students that are coming out of a lot of these schools have inadequate tools because they look at it only from a disciplinary angle.
So if you want to define success as something tangible, you can look at this like that. You can say we are a research institute only, and we have funding for 4 years, for the next 4 years, and we do not have teaching obligations. So success could be measured if we say that after the 4 years pass, that they say, okay, now you can start having your own curriculum, and you can start educating your own students according to what you've researched in the last 4 years. And this will be highly dependable on the demand for these courses, right? So if the students and if the market demands these kind of specialists, then we will get like the permission to continue our teaching and not only researching. So you could define success like that if you want.
Do you want to answer?
Go ahead.
So for me, I think there are two answers. One, and the research directly, I think I would consider it a tangible success if people could implement models and follow these methods as best practices without coming to me directly. So right now, I'm finding that as people buy in, they come to me, or like our collaborator group, and I run a research company, so they'll come looking for, services either from block science or more broadly through the research collaboration to get help with their projects, and it's a single point of failure. And so the research success would be when I could say, go grab these 3 papers, read these 4 case studies, and then, at most you're going to need a little bit of help. You'll have to have these internal expertise, but you won't be only able to do this process with the help of people who are creating it. From a more business side, or more sort of maybe just like quality of life side, I would like to get to the point where I'm picking projects that I'm working on based on their pure merit rather than based on the sustainability of the funding of both the research and the team. Like, I have a team of researchers who are a mixture of economists, systems and controls engineers, data scientists at Block Science, and in fact, that resource pool is paid for, salaries, et cetera, and it's a challenging place to be because, as we discussed, these are pretty bespoke solutions at this phase, and so they're long projects, and it's expensive to do good work. And I would like to get to the point where both the cost of doing work goes down, which is aligned with the best practices rolling out, and then as a result, the sort of choices are driven more ideologically or more academically minded. Like, this is a really cool project, pushing a new boundary or changing the world in a way that I want to see changed, instead of basically who's going to make my bank account stay large enough to make sure that my researchers have peace of mind and can focus on their work.
So we spoke a lot about incentives, and then you also showed this diagram when it comes to many different schools of economics. How do you incentivize everyone to adopt this new language that you're proposing, so you don't end up as another fringe school of economics or control science or whatever else?
First of all,
sorry, I couldn't hear that.
No, he said Austrian. No, people are already jokingly saying about we're the new Austrian School of Economics, and with referencing to Hayek, etc. It makes great sense. And being in Austria. I don't think there is an incentive system. I believe in kind of the law of attraction. I think if our gut feeling of if our assumptions and our conclusions from our research, from this iterative research process that we've started, is correct, people will understand that this is necessary. I don't think there is any way to directly incentivize. from what we're seeing in the real world outside of crypto happening is that people are understanding that we need more complex answers to the problems that we have in our society. We can see that with the Fridays for Future movement, and people are ready for that, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't go in the millions to the streets, and because they know that the boundaries of the nation state is not enough to combat potential climate change. We need more complex answers. We're seeing that the director of the IMF, the new assigned director, is not only an economist but an environmental economist. So I assume that this person is also thinking in more complex systems and externalities and external effects. So from what we're seeing, there are the Trumps of the world, the reactionary politicians, but we are also seeing more complex answers to the complex problems. So I'm quite positive that we're at the right moment in time, doing the right thing, and that other people will follow. Yeah.
So in terms of standards, standard setting, and best practices, it's my experience that forcing a standard is a terrible thing. It never works. And so what you actually need to do is solve, hate to say it, but a form of consensus problem where by not rushing to define a standard, but rather sort of building a community and trying to find a practice before a standard, that the standard actually emerges out of the practice and has in it a level of parametrization or a level of, universality that allows it to be changeable in the right places so that it suits the need of the whole community. So the question of actually this language is not fixed. It's not, we are saying we've determined the language, here, take it. What we're saying is that we're kind of at a trailhead. We kind of see a mountain clearing out of the clouds, and we see a lot of reasons why we need to walk up that hill. And what we're actually doing is coming out here and saying, guys, do you see that? You want to come with us? Let's figure this out. And so from that process, a set of standards or best practices can emerge, and that it'll be useful to the people who participate in it, in its formation. And so the more people start to get on that ball early on, the more perspectives will be rolled in and supported by those emerging best practices.
So as a research lab, do you have any intention of reaching out and doing collaborative work with some of the existing blockchain companies that are already in the ecosystem and potentially developing master's programs where they work side by side with industry?
So yes, we are in fact already, we were working with one of the crypto projects. We signed an NDA. We can't talk about who it is, but you would know them, let's say. So yes, we work, and in fact, I was also talking to Friederike and Gnosis, so we're already talking, right? So that would be, as a research project, the second question, for master's program, as a research institute, we don't teach, but we're already talking to the dean of our university to develop classes and courses. It's not our initial, maybe we won't be doing it, but other people in our university, they're already starting to do that.
So my answer is that we are highly interested in cooperations with projects because what we want to stay as narrow as possible to the applications, right? So we don't want to make research that is very, let's say, scientific and off topic or like perfectionist, I don't know. We would like to solve real world problems. And this is how you can also incentivize, so coming to your question maybe, so this is how you can incentivize people to contribute to research in this domain is because if they see that what people do is appreciated, and it's appreciated on the one hand scientifically, so whatever they produce as a research is going to be used for further research as well, so they're getting citations from what they establish, and also they get appreciation from the financial side. And we are at the point in time where the people who want to make the systems work are the crypto projects, and they also have funding. So this is like the best world you can live in, right? So you're actually working together with projects who are highly interested into making what they believe is right functioning.
So one comment on developing teaching materials. So I think people often underestimate the amount of effort that creating good curriculum is, and even the process through which it's created. So especially for new and advanced stuff, it almost always starts with some form of graduate, at least in the academic setting, graduate seminars and like open-ended versions of the same material that eventually converges into, hey, this is what's really mattering. Hence the example of the courses that I was taking that were just research cross practice that eventually became much of the NETS program. An example of this in the abstract to practical setting is I took a research seminar my first year in graduate school on applied topology. If anyone knows what topology is, it is like the obnoxiously abstract, like mathematical spaces thing, and it was computationally applied to robotics. And the professor who was teaching it is a wonderful teacher. His name is Rob Greist. He's in mathematics and robotics at Penn, and he's also well known for being able to teach calculus in a way that's like useful to people. He actually took a field like topology and showed us how to solve problems like real robotic coverage problems and like discovering holes in sensor net coverage using basically algebraic topology applied to like actual sensor data where it was noisy and messy to the point that you didn't get good enough data. You had like connectivity between the nodes that were covering, and like you just couldn't solve the problem in a sort of metric space kind of way, but you could detect holes and actually adapt the robot's movements to maintain coverage using topological abstractions, and then write code, put it on robots, get coverage. And that leap from obnoxious theoretical complex shit that you don't think applies to making the real system do the thing you want, it's there, but these kinds of collaborations require us to find the match points between those mathematical abstractions and the real problems we want to solve, which is actually part of the reason why I advocate for more people with a robotics background to get involved in crypto. Because the roboticists, whether they're this particular person who taught me applied topology or the other, actually there are several roboticists in my academic lineage who taught me basically multi-stakeholder optimization problems over time, they're actually used to making this really abstract hard math stuff result in like a real measurable thing in the world. And while it's hard and long in the way that we've been talking about it, those are the applied, quote, applied mathematicians or the theoreticians who by definition don't stop at math. They have to get what they want in the real world or it was a failure.
Sherman, I wondered if you could expand on, or you had an opinion on the role of public or international institutions in cryptoeconomic systems. Or the flip side of that question might be if you take like a global existential threat like climate change, whether these kind of networks have a role to play.
So I have a personal opinion that probably these blockchain but the Web3, I like to talk about the Web3, right? These Web3 networks allow global governance. And I think in the end, Bitcoin resolved what the United Nations and the Weltbund, what is it called before it was called the UN, they had a different name, at the beginning of the 20th century, set out to do. But with the massive point of a centralization problem and a time and decision lag that it has, the United Nations and many of the other international organizations, the value proposition was right, but the more people you're trying to govern with top-down structures and top-down networks, the more inefficiencies you have, the principal agent dilemmas you have, and we see that there's so many use cases of where it happens, whether it's the UN or the World Bank, or the idea is good, but unfortunately the type of governance doesn't allow for more efficient systems. And what we're seeing now is that this type of a more distributed, computer-driven, automated, networked world that we live in allows for new types of governance. And I think, and we're seeing that the United Nations and the World Bank, et cetera, all these organizations, they're also very interested in this technology because it can, there are many use cases that are applicable to them. It will be interesting how this will pan out, because a lot of the things that they're doing could be resolved with these decentralized networks, and they might, in a few years, maybe need to redefine themselves.
So maybe one way to think about this is that it would be very interesting to talk about this with the IMF people and also with the World Bank people and United Nations, because one way you can look at this is that what we have right now is we have around 200 economies in the world, right? Nation states that are organized in some way. They have a specific legal framework, they have some policy framework, they have a monetary and market framework within, right? But they struggle a little bit with this intranet, supernatural collaborations, right? So how to collaborate on a global scale, because and now we enter a world where the economies that we live in and that we participate in do not have geographical borders anymore. Right? So if you are participate in a digital system, it doesn't matter where you are. And the problems that we face are also not limited to a specific geographic region. So if you look at climate change, for example, you cannot expect one nation or one country to solve it, right? So what happens is, you can think of this like this, that you have a 90-degree shift in how we will look at our economies, right? So we don't have 200 nation states that try to solve all of their issues side by side, but you will have one economy for one specific purpose, right? So you have a purpose economy for climate, a purpose economy for mobility, purpose economy for whatever. And then if you can manage to have this international collaborations based on these economies, then you can address these problems.
So I actually, in this vein, I want to bring up a concept that was actually from Lane Reddig, who is involved in the Ethereum community, has been for a long time, and then sort of more broadly focused on governance. And we talked a little bit about pushing governance to the end, but only insofar as you can. So in this sense, we would take these sort of supranational, like large-scale, world-level problems and say these, at some level, need to be governed at a high enough scale to make them sort of cover everyone because they're global problems. But then we have layers horizontally from macro scale to micro scale, and that, you know, there's a non-trivial distribution of governance from macro to micro, and that we can actually start to reason about what belongs where. So questions of like, don't destroy the planet kind of makes sense to have like a well-defined purpose economy in a very macro sense. But then what we don't want to do is provide like the level of very tightly controlled governance over everything that needs to be contextualized. So in a sense, it's, you know, local things should be governed locally. And we see a little bit of this in the way things work. We have ranging all the way from local communities to the municipalities in the US, you know, states, nation, like international organizations, et cetera. But, you know, there's a sort of fractal localism there. And then once you realize that we have governance technologies that are starting to be built on a sort of a segmentation closer to what Chris described, you can actually start to ask, not just does this need to be governed, but does this need to be governed here? And so you could even say, oh, okay, that's important, but it's determined here. Or even at the top level, you could say, yeah, this is important, but it's, you know, well resolved at this other level. And so the segmentation allows you to push governance out to the edges so that you're not imposing, you know, things on localities that don't fit the local culture, don't fit in some way. And I actually think that's a really powerful contribution of decentralized governance technologies. Hey, like we don't have to do governance of the thing that needs to be governed at any particular level. We can start to find the right ones.
Yeah, and maybe to add to what Chris was saying, I really liked your analogies. Actually, I wrote, if you follow me, you can follow me on Medium. I wrote maybe 3 or 4 years ago a post on the age of the citizen consumer, I called it. First of all, we live in a very funny world today, right? Today, we're on one hand, we're called citizens, and in the other hand, we're consumers. Now, our market systems, we're free to choose which goods and services we buy into. As citizen, we're kind of coerced into a certain type of nation state we're born into, probably, and switching our status of citizenship comes at a very high opportunity cost, and you might do it once, you probably won't do it twice, right? Now, and it's confined to these nation-state boundaries. And I think that the nation-state was very important up until now, but might be kind of obsolete, as especially ever since internet and free trade. What we're seeing now with the internet, already the Web 2, but much more in the Web 3, that we will be kind of citizen consumers or prosumers of multiple networks. We won't have single identities anymore. We will buy into the value systems of purpose-driven networks we believe in. And it can be a purpose-driven network incentivizing CO2 emission reduction. What we're doing in Vienna hopefully will happen on a global scale. You could have purpose-driven networks incentivizing different economies, different purposes, and then I can freely choose where I'm part of and where not. Yeah.
So by way of analogy, though, we sort of have large-scale purpose-driven networks that we opt into. We just don't know that the purposes are what we want. If you look at the large-scale international tech companies right now, they, for the most part, serve by providing free resources, controlling the flow of information, like doing a lot of things that are state-like. I mean, we have one that launched a consortium to launch a functional reserve currency. So like the boundaries of, the traditional sort of nation state and these emerging international tech companies blur a little bit. And when you take the characterization that Sherman just gave, you could say, okay, well, they're a purpose-driven economy that's purpose is to make their shareholders more money, and they act in a way that interacts with and actually exerts power on and from nations, and you start to see this idea that we have people opting into using Google services, we have people opting into using Facebook services, and the nice thing about this is that you can opt in and out,
exactly.
but
by network effect, right? I fully agree. So this network or this purpose-driven economies, they've started earlier. They didn't start now with the Web 3, but they have a different mechanism. They coerce you in a different way, not by where you're born into, but like by peer pressure, right? So like I'm still on Facebook by peer pressure because I'm using certain functions that are important. And every day I ask myself whether I shouldn't be, but there is this. There is this new levels of, I think, network economies and these network effects. Is something we need to think about, and that are also very relevant in the incentive structures and governance. When we think about blockchain governance and hard forking, and do you choose to be on this side of the fork or the other side of the fork? There is a lot of network effects questions related to that, and that goes also into complexity theory and complexity economics, etc.
So there's this like meme that went around at one point where it had like guys with guns pointed at each other, and it was like big tech, crypto, and like big states. And there's something really important to note about this, and it's not that any one of them should win per se or like the politics of it. It's that they got put on the same playing field. Intuitively, it resonated with people that these three things somehow were like entities in the same way. And what I think we're discovering is that they are these ultimately social political things, organizations, collections of humans aggregated into actors. And that's not to say that it's the only perspective worth taking, but when you realize that it's made up of people engaging with each other, and then those people collectively having these properties that we were just discussing about big tech, purpose-driven economies, networks, people coordinating to achieve some shared goals, information is flowing, decisions are being made, and then as humans roll up into large enough groups, the effects, the interactions between those groups are actually resolved at the sort of, the actor is the aggregate, not the individuals. And one of the things that I think we're seeing is that the state, the big tech company, and the sort of collectives are all, humans together exerting forces on each other. And we don't really know what that looks like. That's not a characterization that says we can predict what's going on. It's just an acknowledgement that some way of describing those things puts them on the same plane, and that feels new. I don't think that before the big tech companies there was anything that could get on the same plane as a nation state, and then before the crypto stuff, there was no way for a highly centralized for a decentralized organization to get on the same plane as a big tech company and a nation state. So what we're starting to figure out is that maybe we can have commons or cooperative entities, not that all of them magically do, but the possibility of a common enterprise that's decentralized getting on the political plane of these things. It certainly hasn't happened yet. It's just a thought.
Quick follow-up to that. You outlined quite well the discomfort we feel with a public good. Kind of the ultimate objective of it is to enrich shareholders. I know unelected shareholders, unelected CEOs, etc. I just wondered whether you thought that the manner in which crypto networks are launched is different enough from that.
I don't.
Right.
There's a very big difference between that which we can do and that which we have done. So, as a researcher whose background was in coordination systems, I got involved in, multi-agent control and optimization and these dynamic resource allocation problems, computational social science problems pre-blockchain. And so I think the blockchain networks are incredibly exciting. I think that content addressable DHTs are incredibly exciting. I think that they're structurally providing us the ability to make larger scale things. I think that we should start with smaller scale things. I'm not advocating for building society scale decentralized commons first. I would expect them to be small community scale first and learn how to build bigger and bigger structures. But I'm recognizing this sort of an ontological similarity for the purpose of asking where this might take us, because until we acknowledge that, it's not necessarily reasonable for us to sort of start to take steps in that direction. But to your point, mostly everything we've done is just reproduce things that we've seen before.
Not even learning from history. So if you look at the power structures in Bitcoin and the incentive system, it's plutocratic. It's like how representative democracy started in the 18th century by only giving vote to those who have money. So our democratic systems didn't start out the way there are now, but only certain type of people could vote, and it was men of a certain social rank in proportion to the amount of money they had or the status in society they had. And then it became a one man, one vote, and then eventually women were included in certain countries, black people were included. And somehow I feel that Bitcoin, for all its worth, and it's amazing and big revolution, everything, universal state layer, but they went back in time and reinstated kind of a plutocratic system, and we're already beyond that. But it reflects maybe the value system in capitalism, what we call capitalism. Our current economic systems favor one stakeholder, is that person who holds capital, and more capital has more rights. And so I think, I hope, I don't know, I hope that Bitcoin is Yahoo, in the sense that when Yahoo came along and the search engines, similar search engines, they thought of content search, online content search in terms of how do you categorize that content like it's a bookshelf, right? And then you had to manually, I even taught people how to manually categorize their content into Yahoo. That was a thing. I made a lot of money teaching that. It's incredible. And until algorithmic search came along, when people then understood that we can take this technology, but we can use this in a very different way that's more adequate to the technology to use actually the power of the data that this technology provides. So I'm hoping that proof of work in the current system, we will have more sophisticated consensus algorithms that are more egalitarian, that come with different value systems, because the value system in Bitcoin, yeah.
So actually, we're going to switch to wrapping up with, I'm going to ask a question from each of the panelists, and that's going to be the sort of wrap-up phase. So I'm going to start with ZX. And so you are probably one of the first people that I've met in crypto who has an education of the form that we had asked about earlier. And so I would like it if you could tell us a bit more about that experience, and also how it could be better.
Yeah, so I think like the benefits definitely, like you can appreciate a lot of the different stream of thoughts, and then like you can synthesize a lot of these things from the different disciplines, and then you can understand a lot of that. But I think like what can be better though, I think now that you have like the knowledge from different disciplines, you necessarily may not go as in depth in each of them. So I think like, but I think that takes time. That's just like, it's a matter of fact. It just takes time to get to more experience overall. So I think, but being able to have that shared language in the first place, I think I feel like the shared language, like, I mean, in Cryptoeconomic, we talk about like how like one term can have like 5 different meanings. And then from my perspective, yeah, I know exactly what those 5 meanings would be. And then I think that's really good. So we basically short circuit that step of like synthesizing, being able to speak the same language, because I know where like the different languages come from. And yeah, I think that's where like the benefit, one of the benefit would be. And something, yeah, and then how it can be better would be like, how do we go more in depth in each of these? Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you. And so Chris, so you did something that's a little bit uncommon, which is to go from a sort of industry business, like, you know, working life back into an academic setting. And I'm curious sort of like, you know, what drove you to do that, and, you know, whether you think we actually need people doing that to get perspective on real world needs for research.
This is funny because I was thinking about this question just 10 minutes ago. So what came into my mind was, I don't know if you know this quote from Steve Jobs, who said, being fired from my own company, as he was the best thing that happened to me, because I was able to let go of all the restrictions that I had, and I was able to start thinking freely again. And this is exactly my answer to your question. So I would say that having seen the world from the inside and having seen the restrictions that are imposed on the people who live there, I was very super excited that I was able to get back from industry into something that in a field that I could contribute in creating. But what was very important to this is because I was on a paid leave. So I was let go from a bank, and they paid me for 6 months. So the answer to your question is people need to do this, but people need some kind of funding in order to make sure that they overcome some kind of transition phase. Yeah.
Cool. So Sherman, so my question for you is, as the sort of director of this interdisciplinary research group, sort of the way in which you came to founding it included a very long path through a lot of fields, and this is sort of orthogonal to what you see in most academic groups, where hyper-specialization drives research rather than sort of interdisciplinarity. And I'm curious how sort of both, again, the positives and negatives to coming to leading a research organization from this more interdisciplinary, more breadth-first background.
What is the question?
So I want to know the path that took you. So kind of with each of these guys, like how you got to...
Yes, it's a very long story. To cut it short, I started out... in more or less, my second job was in academia, because I did my PhD, and then I got this job at this university where I'm now. And I loved academia, but I hated that I needed to do disciplinary research because I had a broad scope, and I realized that I couldn't do that. And together with some other pain points in my life, I completely changed my life, did many other things, among others arts and different countries, different jobs, a multitude of things that I did. And eventually companies that I started, and eventually in Berlin at some point I was running a startup. Somebody told me about blockchain. And then I understood that this was the answer to so many questions, governance questions of our world. I intuitively understood it and then iterated my knowledge by starting the blockchain hub in Berlin, which was kind of a kind of knowledge, kind of educational hub and information hub, which ultimately by coincidence then led me back to university, and where they gave me the opportunity to start an interdisciplinary research institute, which was why I left the university. So it's quite funny how life happens. I think so I'm very happy that I can do it. It was never a master plan to do such a thing. And I would maybe like to close my thing by saying I think it's an enormous opportunity. I don't know how it happened. It was certainly never planned. I think that blockchain networks and the Web3 are first and foremost a socio-economic revolution. So the technology is revolutionary because it enables a socio-economic revolution. And to tie into the question that was asked before, we can only do things in a new way if we change our mindset. And I think this needs to happen. It takes more time, and we can see it with Libra. It's an association. It's a group of people. It's 30 institutions that are not designed. Their DNA doesn't work towards collaboration, and they're forced to collaborate. And you see that at the first stumbling block, the collaboration falls apart because it's not in their DNA to collaborate. So I think one of the things that we will see is that we need to do much more work on the social and economical transition level until this becomes successful.
Yeah, just echoing that, I think like coming from an interdisciplinary education background, like when I first heard of blockchain, I was like, that's exactly where it should be. You know, like all these other disciplines that we learn about just all come together very naturally in this field, and especially in cryptoeconomics.
So I'm going to wrap up with sort of a call to action to participate in what we're talking about as interdisciplinary research, but to do it in a way that isn't necessarily eschew fields, because the way that you actually solve these systems is by having both disciplinary experts and interdisciplinarians tying them together. So the role of a systems engineer in my field is to be like an architect is in their field, to know enough about every expertise to work with the experts who know much more than them to synthesize a whole that meets the human end need. And that's the class of problem we're facing. So we need disciplinary experts with some knowledge of their interdisciplinary context. We need interdisciplinary experts with knowledge of the disciplines enough to collaborate. And we need us to sort of come together to make that happen. That is a much bigger than us. It's bigger than this event. And it's something that, I'm hoping that this is the seed of. So thank you very much.